He was a forest ranger. Now, something is following me. I've always loved the tranquility of nature. The peace you feel walking among the trees and venturing deep into the woods is unparalleled. I also enjoy gazing at the clear night sky, one of the most pleasant experiences you can have when surrounded by the silence of the forest. Seeing so many stars reminds me of how small we truly are, how insignificant our existence is. We could disappear in an instant, and the universe wouldn't even notice. My brother always took me camping with him, and that's when I discovered my passion for nature. Now, I enjoy hiking or camping with my friends since my brother moved out of the country. I hope to see him soon. I really miss spending time with him. I worry I may not have the privilege of doing so, given my current situation. But hope is all I have left. If you're reading this, please pray for me. I need it. I won't share specific details about myself, as I don't consider them important. I'll just say I'm 26 years old. That's all I'll disclose. Now let me tell you how I ended up in this situation. Recently, I started working as a forest ranger. At first, everything seemed fine, but the fact that I was hired without an interview should have raised some red flags. I was desperate for a job since I had very little money, so I didn't think twice about it. The day I arrived at the cabin was beautiful. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange light filtering through the trees. The weather was pleasant, typical of a clear summer day. Everything seemed perfect. The cabin was almost entirely made of classic wood. I thought it was spacious enough for one or two people and looked very cozy inside. I walked in, dropped my backpack under the bed, opened the wardrobe, and changed into my sleepwear. As I settled in, I noticed a piece of paper on the table next to a survival guide and a metal crucifix. Something felt off. I picked up the note and felt the blood drain from my face as I began to read it. Hi, my name is Kali Ansor, and I was the previous forest ranger who worked here. I don't want to scare you, but this job is not what you think. You see, strange things happen here, and they can be deadly if you don't carefully follow what I'm about to tell you. To survive, this note will be your Bible. The rules I've written here are things I discovered on my own while working here. I don't know if this is everything, but it covers what usually happens. If the light bulb in your cabin starts flickering suddenly, shut the door immediately, close the curtains, and turn off the lights. The thing will approach your cabin and try to get inside. Don't panic. It will leave if it doesn't find a way in. Always close the door behind you when you leave. If you don't, the thing will be waiting for you inside the cabin, hiding somewhere. If you hear scratching sounds coming from outside the cabin, don't trust your ears. It's not coming from outside, it's inside. Stay still and hold your breath. The thing is blind and won't know you're there. If you do this, it should leave before you count to 10. While outside, stay as quiet as possible, or it will hear you. If it does, run back to the cabin and barricade the door. If you ever get injured, clean the wound quickly and cover it to ensure no blood is visible. The thing can smell blood from a distance, and it drives it wild. Also, change the bandage often. When you do, burn the old one in the fire. Never leave your cabin after sunset or before sunrise, no matter what. The thing is much more aggressive in the dark. Before you sleep, place the metal crucifix I left for you pointing toward the cabin's entrance. Set your alarm for 3 a.m. and wake up to check the crucifix. If it has blood on it, ignore Rule 6. Leave the cabin as quickly as you can and run to the storm shelter. I've marked it for you on the survival guide map. Do not attempt to leave the forest until your contract expires, or the thing will follow you wherever you go. You have been warned. Some situations may require you to combine the rules, so make sure to remember them all. Good luck and stay safe. What the hell have I gotten myself into? Agitated thoughts raced through my mind. I was both angry and confused. I didn't know if the note was a prank or if it was real. Maybe this guy, Collian, just wanted to scare me. But I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to follow what was written on that paper, at least until I could figure out if it was fake or not. When I was hired, no one told me that someone had left before I arrived. Maybe they knew I wouldn't take the job if they told me. Soon, night fell. I was tired and almost forgot to position the crucifix facing the door. Then, I went to bed. The next day, I woke up to find a large scratch on my right arm. It was bleeding. I quickly cleaned the wound and wrapped it in a bandage. I also tossed my blood-stained shirt and sheets into the fire. I froze. How did this happen? Then I remembered the rule. Wake up to check the crucifix. If it has blood, leave the cabin. I hadn't checked the crucifix. I have to admit, I was scared. The list of rules wasn't a joke. Collian knew something I didn't, and he wanted to warn me about it. I hadn't seen the thing he described in the note yet, but I was sure I didn't want to encounter it, not after what happened that day. I checked the crucifix to see if it had blood on it. Yes, I know, I should have done it hours earlier. It looked fine. Then why had I woken up with a huge scratch on my arm? What the hell is going on? I spent the rest of the day in bed, too afraid to leave the cabin and check the forest. That night, I followed the rules exactly as I should have the night before. I placed the crucifix facing the door and woke up at 3 a.m. to check it. It was fine. The next 5 days were peaceful. I finally gathered the courage to do my actual job and inspect the forest. I was quiet and didn't attract any unwanted attention. Those were the best days. I could really enjoy being in nature and relax for a while. I felt so disconnected from the problems in my life, experiencing a sense of peace. It was as if the rules didn't exist, except for the nighttime ones and closing the door. I was there, enjoying my time. I didn't miss my normal days before I got the job. I cherished every last moment of those calm days, and I'm glad I did, because things started to get worse. On the 8th day, I was inside the cabin, reading a book while lying on the bed, when I heard it, scratching sounds. They seemed to be coming from outside. I remembered the rule. If you hear scratching, don't trust your ears. It's not coming from outside, it's inside. Stay still and hold your breath. It should leave before you count to 10. I quickly shut my eyes and froze in place on the bed, holding my breath. I could feel the thing's breath as it sniffed around me. I think it smelled fresh meat, an easy meal. I began counting. I was about to reach 10 when I heard a loud noise. The thing bolted out of the cabin through the door. I ran and shut it, locking it. Then I collapsed onto the floor. When I woke up, it was nearly midnight. Oh God, the crucifix! I quickly ran to position it facing the door. I had failed this rule. I'm going to die. These thoughts haunted me until 3 a.m. when I checked it. My heart started pounding so fast, it felt like it would tear through my chest. The crucifix had blood on it. Panicking, I grabbed the survival guide and a flashlight and ran toward the storm shelter. I could feel the thing following me, getting closer and closer. After 15 minutes of running, I reached the storm shelter. I leapt inside and shut the door behind me. Then I collapsed to the floor from the pain in my left leg. I think I broke my ankle while trying to escape the beast outside. I crawled into a corner and fell asleep, waking up before dawn from the sharp pain in my ankle. Then I fell asleep again. When I woke up, I wondered how I was going to get back to the cabin with a broken ankle. I improvised a walking stick with a wooden branch in the storm shelter and started hobbling back to the cabin. I had to call for help. There's no cell service in the forest, and the cabin doesn't have a landline. Also, I'm not a doctor, and I can't do much for my ankle. As I walked through the forest, I could feel that the thing from before was watching me, smiling at me. I was easy prey. I could no longer escape it. My heavy steps left deep marks in the ground as I grew more and more exhausted. I eventually made it back to the cabin, ate something, and then thought of something risky. I planned to leave the forest the next day. I knew it was stupid, and I also knew what would happen if I did. It was written in the rules. I lost track of time while pondering my decision, and soon it was dark outside again. I turned on the light, and soon it began flickering. Not now, I thought to myself. I turned the light off, as instructed by the rules. Shortly after, I could hear it. The thing was outside the cabin, trying to find a way in. It began clawing at the walls and ramming its body against the door. I accidentally caught a glimpse of it through a small gap in a window. It was tall and had pale skin, almost like snow. You could see the veins in it was so pale. It had long limbs and large, sharp claws like blades. But the most terrifying part was its head. It was human, but its eyes were missing. It had large, dark, empty sockets, so dark you could look into them and feel the sensation of sinking into an abyss. You could sense the terrible hunger for human flesh that this creature possessed. I was terrified. It wanted to tear me apart, rip my flesh, and feed on it. It was only a matter of time before it caught me. After a while, it left. I went to place the crucifix facing the door and also checked it. It was clean. A lucky night. I had to rest for the next day. The next morning, I woke up and got ready to leave the forest once and for all. I left the cabin and started walking toward the edge of the forest. I moved slowly since I still had to use the improvised walking stick from before. I hadn't eaten for a long time, so I was trapped in agonizing hunger. I stumbled and fell to the ground. The noise was loud, loud enough to attract that thing to me. I saw it approaching, smiling with its teeth in anticipation. I was finished. Then I heard something in the forest. A very loud roar echoed through the trees, and it seemed to frighten the thing from before. A beast similar to it then appeared, running on all fours, and the two collided in a fight. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The newly arrived monster scared off the other, which fled like a wounded animal back to the thick tree line. I noticed that the beast was wearing a tattered ranger's uniform, or what was left of it. On the badge, I could read the name of the wearer, Kellen Suter. The thing ran back into the forest, chased by the other beast. What just happened? I was very confused until I remembered that Kalyan Sor was also the name of the last ranger who worked in this forest. Why had he turned into a beast, and why had he attacked the other one? I was grateful to be alive. I got up and continued walking to leave the forest. I made it to the road and got into my car. I called 911 since I was injured, cold, and scared. After that, I lost consciousness. I woke up in a hospital bed. Something was scratching at the door, and I knew what had happened. I had broken the last rule. Do not attempt to leave the forest until your contract expires, or the thing will follow you wherever you go. Now I'm sitting in my hospital bed, afraid of what came out of that forest and is now following me. I can feel its hunger. It wants my flesh, and I know a door won't be enough to stop it. As the hinges gave way more and more, I prepared for the looming doom ahead. I accepted the fact that I was going to die. But I got lucky again. It left before the door gave in. I feel like it's toying with me, preying on my fear, and it knows I can't do much about it. As I write this, I've just been discharged from the hospital. I'm sitting on my bed at home. I know it's only a matter of time before I see that creature again. But this time, I'm not going to run. I'm going to face whatever it is. I'm a new ranger with the United States Forest Service, and I'm nervous about some strange things that have been happening lately. Before I begin, there's something you need to understand about the forest, and I mean the deep wilderness, over 50 miles from any station or sign of civilization. After a certain point, everything begins to blend together. The longer you stay there, the smaller you become, until you're just another part of the environment, a movement through the valleys and peaks. It's disheartening. It kills the ego. You forget things about yourself, and your instincts take over. It becomes natural, but it also makes you feel like a lunatic. That's why we never spend more than 8 days alone in the wilderness at a time. That being said, my first few months on the job were everything I wanted. I spent a lot of time outdoors, mostly maintaining trails in the wilderness and checking out some old plots the Forest Service had acquired back in the 50s. The pine beetle epidemic was especially bad in my region this year, so I spent a lot of time marking mortality rates in an area, among other details. For the most part, I loved my job. I'm a bit of an introvert, so working alone outdoors is perfect for me. But there have been a few moments that still make me uncomfortable when I think about them. A couple of weeks after I started, I woke up early and drove out to a pretty rough, heavily wooded section of the wilderness with lots of elevation. I was trying to check on a spot that some backpackers who had just returned from a week-long hike had reported. They said they'd seen campfires a few nights ago. They claimed the fires seemed to be a few hundred yards off the trail and that there appeared to be people around the flames. An aerial crew couldn't find any signs of campfires, like the backpackers had described, so they assumed it had been falsely reported. Still, we had a very strict burn ban in effect, and I was sent to check and make sure. I got about 20 miles in before I found the section of trail I needed blocked off by dirt, destroyed by some kind of landslide. It must have been recent. The backpackers and the aerial crew hadn't noticed it, and someone definitely would have reported it. I couldn't drive any farther, but I was only about 2 miles from the site. So I grabbed my pack, checked my water, and radioed the forest station from my ATV to let them know I'd be walking the rest of the way. I probably should have waited for a team to come clear the trail, but we were all very concerned about a fire, and I won't lie, I was annoyed at the thought of the backpackers being so careless. You couldn't miss the signs at the forest entrance warning about wildfires and announcing the burn ban. There was no reason to be reckless. So, I hiked out. It was only about 10:30 a.m. when I set off. I expected it would take me about 2 hours to reach the area where the fires had been reported. The elevation gain was steep, so I had to stop every now and then to catch my breath. After hiking for a while, I paused for a moment and realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. This isn't that unusual. If you've ever backpacked or even gone on long hikes, you know it's easier than you think to wander off the trail, even for someone experienced. I'm one of the newer, younger rangers, but I've spent a lot of time outdoors backpacking and generally have a great sense of direction, so I wasn't too alarmed about not knowing exactly where I was. You get used to being lost. What did alarm me was noticing a pinkish tint lighting up the forest. The sun was about to dip behind the tree line covering the mountain to the west. I didn't think I'd been hiking for that long. I'd covered maybe a mile and a half in an hour, or so I thought. However, it seemed like it was almost 7 p.m. I quickly decided that the safest thing to do was to head back south toward my ATV, which had all my night gear, and return tomorrow. It would be embarrassing to explain to the other rangers that I'd lost track of time, but it would be worse to get stuck out here overnight without proper gear. I could freeze to death. Plus, they'd start wondering why I hadn't returned after such a long time. I grabbed a few loose rocks from the ground and left a marker to indicate I'd been there, then headed in the direction I thought I'd wandered off the trail. I quickly found it again, but it was a section I hadn't passed before. Somehow, I'd ended up farther north, and curiously, I saw a yellow trail marker not too far up the mountain. I realized it was the marker for the next 10-mile section, the area mentioned in the fire reports. The sun was nearly touching the mountains now, but I decided to hike at least up to the marker, stay for a few minutes, and then head back quickly before it got completely dark. I recognized that this wasn't ideal, but at the time it seemed better than heading back with nothing to report. I walked a few dozen yards to the marker and looked out over the valley to the east. It seemed empty, nothing unusual. I took a sip from my water bottle and waited another 5 minutes. Still, I saw nothing, so I decided to head out. I hadn't gone even a mile when I smelled smoke coming down from the mountain. I looked around but couldn't see any smoke columns. It was a bit unsettling. The sunset was so red that everything seemed to glow in a surreal way. Concerned, I stumbled through the last stretch back and made the call immediately. By then, the night was darker, and there was no trace of fire in the valley, despite the smoke I'd smelled earlier. I decided to spend the night on the trail, just in case whatever had caused it showed up again. I set up a temporary camp with my one-person tent and waited out the night. Nights in the wilderness are different from camping anywhere else. In the back of your mind, you recognize that you're completely alone for dozens of miles. You end up listening to the night differently. Every sound suddenly becomes important because now you're just another part of the forest, vulnerable. At some point, I woke up from a dream I can no longer remember. But I do remember feeling uneasy. I poked my head out of the tent and stepped outside to pee and look around for a moment. I didn't see anything, but it's hard to explain exactly how I felt. It was almost like I was being watched, but in a very subtle way, like I was part of the background. It was a little unsettling, so I went back to sleep pretty quickly. The next morning, an aerial reconnaissance team flew over the area and still didn't find anything. Around midday, the crew arrived to clear the landslide and the other rangers, and I started combing through the wilderness. By the end of the second day, we found it. A section of the forest had completely burned. It was hidden in a valley to the northeast, just a few hundred yards from where I had camped the first night, but I had overlooked it then. It was maybe 200 yards wide and 300 yards downhill on the mountainside. You'd think it would be too big to miss, but it took us almost 2 days to find it. Even so, the aerial team had completely overlooked it. This was a strange fire, too. It had burned in an almost clean line along the mountain ridge, forming a recognizable diamond shape. Normally, wildfires around here aren't intense enough to completely kill mature pine trees, but this fire had burned hot. Everything was charred, total mortality. It almost seemed unnatural, but we couldn't find anything in the ashes to explain it. I wondered if I had missed something for a few days after we left. But eventually, after talking to the veteran rangers, I decided it was just one of those things that can't be explained. Apparently, it's not that unusual, according to them. They said if you spend enough time in nature, you start to notice things noticing you. I didn't know what they meant by that, but we didn't have time to talk more, and I haven't seen much of them since then. A week after that, I came across a couple of idiots trying to light a cooking fire at one of the trailheads. I yelled at them, probably more than I should have. They seemed genuinely apologetic. Apparently, they'd missed all the signs. I decided to let it slide and started to leave. But before I drove off, I saw the spark and flash of a fire in my rearview mirror. Furious, I turned around and got out of the vehicle, but the campers looked as confused as I was. The fire pit was completely cold. It looked the same as before, empty and unused. After making them clean up the twigs and leaves they'd tried to use, I walked around the entire trailhead, confused, but I didn't see any signs of fire. I assumed it was a trick of the light in the mirror and left. I convinced myself in the following months not to worry about the strange fire incidents, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened until a few days ago. I was doing trail maintenance with another ranger, Lauren. She had been working as a ranger for nearly 10 years, so I generally followed her lead. We were about 15 miles into the wilderness, inspecting some primitive backpacking camps. At that moment, we were at Camp 3. There are a total of 8 camps, forming a large loop of nearly 90 miles around one of the region's largest mountains. Autumn was approaching, so the area was supposed to be empty. As we worked on the campsite quality, I had spent the entire afternoon carving out a new trail from the camp to a spring that had recently shifted course. The shadows were starting to grow longer, but I was close to finishing, so I kept cutting. About half an hour later, I broke through the brush and stepped onto a large rock slab that sloped down toward the ground. From there, I could see the spring's headwaters faintly visible further up the mountain. It looked like a deer trail wound its way toward the source, so I started climbing. When I got there, I nearly threw up. The spring water flowed clear, but just to the right, a patch of earth had turned into worn stone. In the middle of it, a skinned deer lay in a pool of blood, half with splatters and other puddles of blood scattered around. I've seen plenty of dead animals before, but this was disturbing. Something had skinned the deer very cleanly, with no signs of damage elsewhere. It had bled out, and God, there was blood everywhere. But its skin wasn't anywhere to be seen. Flies were beginning to gather around the meat. It didn't seem like it had been dead for very long. I quickly headed back down the several hundred yards of trail I had just cleared and found Lauren, who had already finished working and was prepping dinner. I stopped to catch my breath and told her I needed to show her something. She looked concerned, so we went back to the spring. When we got there, the deer was gone, and I couldn't find a single drop of blood. I had only been gone for maybe an hour at most. It didn't seem possible. Lauren assumed I was joking, so I let it go and tried to forget about it, but I haven't forgotten. And apparently, Lauren told my supervisor. Jonathan asked me to return to the forest station, so tomorrow I'll be leaving the wilderness. However, he sounded different, almost like he didn't really want to call me. I guess I'll see how it goes and update this when I can. Something unexplainable happened to me in the forest. I'm still shaking, and I don't know if I'll be able to recount this coherently, but I'll do my best because I need help understanding what just happened. Maybe someone can offer me a plausible explanation to help ease this fear. There's a nature park with hiking trails about 10 miles from my house. I live in a fairly suburban area, so it's hard to find places to hike without running into other people or dogs. Plus, it's nice to walk among trees and see deer instead of rows of houses and fences. My dog and I hike there often. I know most of the trails by heart, even though my sense of direction is terrible. This morning after breakfast, I decided to take my dog there. We enjoy hiking when no one else is around. It feels more like we're truly deep in nature. And I thought Christmas Eve morning would be a time when everyone else would be visiting family, cooking, or otherwise occupied indoors. I was right. There were no other cars in the parking lot when I arrived, not even employees. The park's museum section was closed for Christmas, though the trails remained open. Like many places, this December has been much warmer than usual. It was warm with a pleasant breeze, perfect hiking weather. There's no cell service or internet on the trail, so no calls or emails could distract me until I was done. My dog and I headed down the most wooded trail, where we were most likely to see exciting wildlife rather than just squirrels. The first mile or so was completely normal. We saw squirrels and heard birds, and my dog sniffed every scat pile he could find. It had rained a few days ago, so parts of the trail were just puddles of mud I had to trudge through, but nothing unusual. It was relaxing, a great way to start the holidays. I don't know how to explain what changed, but I started feeling uneasy. Everything startled me. It was like every shadow could be hiding something. I felt like we weren't alone. I should mention that this isn't exactly an unfamiliar feeling for me. I love horror movies and stories, and of course, plenty of them start with a character alone in the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just the memory of a recent scary story I'd read coming back to haunt me now that I was alone. Anyway, I trust my dog to act as a detector for paranormal activity. They always say animals are more sensitive than humans, so I rely on her to let me know if something's not right. She kept doing her usual thing, sniffing around and whatnot, so I tried to ignore it. The farther we went, the more I heard things crunching just off the trail, as if someone was walking alongside me in the forest. I couldn't see anything, and again, my dog was oblivious. I told myself it was just deer or squirrels scampering about, more active than usual because there weren't any other hikers around. My presence was probably startling them out of hiding. It was at the start of the third mile, around that time, when I started feeling extremely cold for no apparent reason. Normally, I'm always warm, and that morning was a pleasant 70 degrees Fahrenheit with what felt like 1,000,000% humidity. It was overcast, and it's always cooler in the forest, but not like this. I was sweating, and my skin felt hot, but it was as if I were freezing from the inside out, like someone had chilled my bones. I decided I was probably getting sick and that I should pick up the pace so I could get home and take my temperature. The trail is a 4-mile loop that takes you back to the parking lot at the end. By that point, I'd gone just over halfway, so I decided to finish the trail rather than turn back. An insane pressure started building in my ears, like they were about to pop, though they never did. My throat started burning and hurting every time I swallowed, like trying to swallow a stick. I also started getting stomach cramps. I decided I was definitely sick, maybe with the flu or COVID or something. So I quickened my pace, thinking diarrhea might hit me soon, and I didn't want to get stuck in the woods without an acceptable bathroom nearby. We'd probably gone about a quarter of a mile more when we came to a fork in the trail where there absolutely shouldn't have been one. The main trail has several offshoots branching off it, but those are all at the beginning. I've walked this trail dozens of times and can guarantee there shouldn't have been a fork here. I stopped for a few seconds and just stared at it, confused. I've mentioned my terrible sense of direction, so I tried to explain to myself that maybe I'd gotten disoriented at some point without realizing it because I felt so sick. Still, this park has a map and a bench at every fork to keep people from getting lost. And I didn't see either, which only made me more uncomfortable and made me realize I had no idea which path to take. When my dog started pulling toward the right-hand path, I decided to trust her instincts and follow her. I can't say exactly what made me stop, but suddenly everything inside me was screaming to turn back. My sense of direction is almost always wrong, so I usually go the opposite way of what my intuition tells me. But this was totally different. I had the unsettling feeling that if I kept walking, I'd be heading straight into danger, no matter what my dog thought. She looked just as lost as I felt. A headache was also building in my skull, as if someone had injected air directly into my brain, pressing against my temples, begging to be released. I stopped and closed my eyes for a second, trying to gather my thoughts and get my bearings. When I opened my eyes, I noticed a deer standing in the middle of the trail, maybe 20 feet, 6 meters away. It was staring directly at me, completely still, unblinking. It had one horn, spaced exactly between its ears, and was sitting like a dog, with its back legs tucked underneath its body. Otherwise, it looked normal, deer-colored, deer-shaped, deer eyes. But that only made the differences even more unsettling. I stared blankly at it for a few seconds before vaguely remembering I had my phone and should take a picture. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, but it wouldn't load, just a black screen, as if someone had covered the lens. Frustrated, I closed the app and lowered my phone to see if the deer was still there or if it had bolted because of my movement. I wish it had. But when I moved my phone, I saw the deer had halved the distance between us. Even though I hadn't heard a sound. It was also standing now, but it looked wrong, like it was putting too much weight on its front legs. The front legs were slightly bent, like it was about to charge. That was it. No photo was worth this. I turned around and started running in the opposite direction. I'd only gone a few steps before my arm was jerked backward. My dog hadn't moved. She was straining against her harness, trying to head back down that path. The deer was even closer than before, though now it was sitting again. I yanked on my dog's leash harder than I ever had before, and she reluctantly came back to me. I ran despite the pain in my stomach, lungs, head, everything. I ran. I'm not the fittest person, but I ran what felt like miles back the way we came, away from the fork that shouldn't have been there, and whatever was wrong with that deer. I could hear my dog panting and wheezing as she fell behind, but I didn't let it slow us down. Even when my legs burned and I felt like I was about to pass out, we ran until we reached the parking lot. We jumped into the car and I sped back home. I don't have an explanation for what happened. Even stranger, I feel fine now. No fever, my throat feels normal, and my headache is gone. My stomach is still upset, and my legs are incredibly sore, but that's probably because I'm not used to running like that, or running at all. My dog is exhausted, but otherwise seems no worse for wear. One more thing. I had set my Fitbit to track the hike before we went in, as I like to know how far we've gone. The loop should have been just over 4 miles, plus a little extra for the detour we took. But according to my Fitbit, we only walked 2 miles. The strangest part is that it says we walked those 2 miles in an hour and a half. I'm not the fastest hiker in the world, but I definitely walk faster than that. And I spent the last half hour running as fast as I could. I know for certain we went farther than 2 miles in that time, but apparently part of the hike just disappeared. In any case, I think I'll bring a friend next time.